America's outreach to the African continent continues, with Vice President Kamala Harris addressing a crowd in the Ghanaian capital Accra earlier. In a wide-ranging speech, Harris touched on topics such as digital inclusion and women's empowerment. She also called for stronger governance, a message that could ruffle some feathers in other African countries. Here's what the VP said earlier.
Together, we can unleash growth and opportunity that far exceeds what either the public or private sector can achieve on its own. And the United States is committed to build these types of partnerships to increase digital inclusion on the continent. And finally, to create inclusive economic growth and to advance innovation, we must continue to support and invest in good governance and democracy.
Well, VP Harris is also set to visit Tanzania and Zambia on her trip. But it's raised questions about why Nigeria, Africa's largest economy and the most populous black nation in the world, is not on her list of countries to visit. Well, joining us now is Ambassador Humphrey Orjiakor, who was Nigeria's former permanent representative to the UN office in Geneva. Thank you so much for being on the news tonight. We do appreciate your time. And that's a good place to start it. Nigeria has, one of the largest populations, in fact, the largest black populated country. Her economic and, political influence on the continent is massive. But when it comes to U.S. officials visiting, she's snubbed. Why do you think this is so?
Thank you, Adesua, for inviting me to this program. I do not think that Kamala Harris took the decision all by herself to exclude Nigeria from her African tour. You recall that previous presidents have been to Africa too, and they didn't come to Nigeria. And I also know that so many other important world leaders have visited Africa, and Nigeria wasn't part of the itinerary. Sometimes it doesn't really mean that Nigeria is being snubbed as such, but when it becomes a kind of given that these high-profile trips take place and Nigeria is excluded, if it becomes regular, then obviously Nigeria needs to introspect, look at its domestic policies that actually determine its foreign policy, and of course look at the conduct of its own foreign policy and judge by itself whether there is something it's not doing right, which makes the rest of the world not look at Nigeria the way Nigeria looks at itself as a major contender, a major player in the African continent, in the West African sub-region, and an aspiring big player in global geopolitics. We need to examine all of that and see why it is possible for a country like Nigeria, with all the potentials you have mentioned, is being excluded from international engagements at such high bilateral levels.
From Ambassador, could it just be, I'm wondering, are they thinking that maybe they should visit what I could call smaller countries because they need more as such visit, that Nigeria is a big brother? And you talked about what we may not be doing. So in your own calculation, what do you then think that Nigeria should be doing? Speak on those two scenarios I've painted for you.
To be acknowledged as a major global player, as the dawn of Africa's diplomacy, you have to provide leadership. And in recent years, I do not believe that Nigeria has played the leadership role that its potentials designated to play in the African continent. You can take so many examples some decades ago. I don't think that any major event or decision could take place in West Africa, especially ECOWAS West Africa, without Nigeria being on the top of things. Today, a lot of things are happening, from Mali to Burkina Faso to Guinea, Conakry to wherever. And the influence Nigeria used to wield in these places is no longer there. Take another example. ECOWAS should be Nigeria's vehicle to launch itself as a leader of bringing the sub-region to the continent. But in this decade, in the past few years, the African Union took what some consider the most, in fact, the most strategically important decision since the African Union took origins in 1963. That was the Agenda 2063, whose flagship ACTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement area. Nigeria should have been at the top of all of that. Some people will say, yes, Nigeria was right there at the back, front and center during the negotiations. But after that, Nigeria was missing in action. And if you ask my personal opinion, and I know a lot of professionals share this opinion, the only way to gauge East-West relations with the African continent today is their attitude towards disposition to collaborating, cooperating with Africa to realize the success of AFTA. Nigeria wasn't there. Even Nigeria became the last country to sign. That was pretty strange. That's not leadership. Today, the continent needs Nigeria's leadership dearly, very dearly, to ensure that AFTA does not just pass us by again like a breeze, like a reed in the wind. This is the problem Africa has had. We have beautiful ideas, very strategic ideas that could take us to a level of stability and prosperity. And of course, the implementation becomes the problem. Nigeria should show leadership. Take a look at when Nigeria recently was closing borders with its neighbors. Excuse me, that's not what a leader does. You talk things over. Take a look at the security and insecurity situations in the country itself. If you recall, Mr. Tony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, did come here. I think was that November 2001, I think. And he said something that members of the administration were clapping about. He said that they observed the various insecurities in Nigeria. He wasn't just talking about the Boko Haram terrorism and bandits and all of that. He was also talking about the economic insecurities in Nigeria at the time, which has not abated. In fact, it has gotten worse. So I have to tell you, he gave us a very snide warning. He said, relevance in international geopolitics is a function of the leadership you provide, a function of the domestic politics you play, the stability of your country, the security of the people, of investments, of everything. In recent times, if we have to be honest to ourselves, I do not think that Nigeria has shown, demonstrated those elements of effective national leadership, regional and continental leadership.
Great.
That could be a problem too.
Indeed, and just to say that Anthony Blinken was here in 2021, we're trying to remember that date. But let me ask you, as the U.S. tries to reboot its relationship with the African continent, tell us, how important are these visits?
These visits are quite important. If you again recall, when this administration came on stream, there was what we call, I would call it haphazard actually, pivot to the east. It has started, I think, under President Jonathan's administration, but took on a life of its own when this administration came, to the extent that China became front and center of the Nigerian geo-economy, as it were. You talk about rail, you talk about road, you talk about power, you talk about infrastructure. It was all really a pivot eastwards. But that was not playing the neutrality, east-west neutrality politics that seemed to have served Nigeria better in years past. Again, there's another problem. If you are pivoting to the east, you must make sure that your west flank is also properly covered. And maybe, if anybody thinks that these visits are not important, then you're not recognizing the fact that it won't be too long before we talk about debt forgiveness. Because already we are owing some 77 trillion, it could be more. Our economy is in disarray right now. To get money from our banks seems to be rocket science. There are so many things that need to be done. And frankly, I do not take a look at our security problems. It's not something the East can solve. We need collaboration from both sides of the divide. And I don't think we have done very well with that pivot. Take a look at Russia's invasion of the Ukraine and Nigeria's ambivalence in this thing. If you take the economic dimension, I can tell you Nigeria was the only oil-producing exporting country that didn't make a cent out of the energy crisis that has risen. Question is why? Why did China not help us to fill the gap, fix the problems? Were Western oil companies disengaging from Nigeria? Why was it that way? This is the first time in our history that there was a global energy crisis and Nigeria didn't benefit anything. So it does matter that we balance our relations between the East and the West.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Humphrey Orjiakor, for gracing Newsnight.